So, welcome to the AMATIC 2014 webinar series. Sure, you're teaching, but are they learning with Sandee House? And this presentation is sponsored by the Placement and Assessment Committee of AMATIC. And AMATIC is the American Mathematical Association of Two-Year Colleges, and our core value is building expertise and exhibiting leadership in the teaching and learning of mathematics, enhancing personal growth, and improving teaching methods and effectiveness as a personally initiated lifelong responsibility. And for more information, please visit our website at amatic.org. And please note that the views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATIC, and any commercial products mentioned by presenters are not endorsed by AMATIC. And so now we're going to switch to the presenter slides. So let me put these up. And
Thanks, John. Before we get started, I want to make sure everybody can hear me. So if you would set your status to agree with the green check. So if you could give me a green check, it's at the top. This is another way that I'll ask questions throughout the session. Great. Looks like most of you can hear me. And then if you would clear your status, at the bottom, the same drop-down menu in the upper left-hand corner. It's the third icon. There's volume, microphone, and then red check. Red X, green check. Great. So today we're going to talk about assessment, and I think that first I should give my disclaimer that I am certainly not an assessment expert, but I think 29 years of doing assessment, both formative and summative, I certainly am an experienced assessor, and I have recently become very, very interested in the psychological concept of metacognition, where students are thinking about their thinking or thinking about how they learn. And that's a huge part of assessment and part of what we are and should be doing in the classroom. So the teaching part we know we're doing, and we're doing well. The question is, are they learning? And I think that each semester we're all faced with this question of what our students have learned and have they met the goals of the class in terms of what they should learn. So I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the goals for this webinar. So we'll talk about assessment, obviously, and we'll talk about learning objectives. I want to talk to you about taxonomies because some of us may have come through colleges of education where we learned about Bloom's taxonomy, but there's another really interesting taxonomy out there that takes this concept of metacognition into account, and I think it's very interesting. You may or may not have heard of that taxonomy. And of course, the two major kinds of assessments that we do in our classrooms, the formative assessment and the summative assessment. We want to talk about teaching and learning and the assessment cycle, and we'll discuss the need for developing these metacognitive skills in students, particularly those who tend to be lower performing. And it's very easy to determine in your classroom who is good at metacognition and who is not good at metacognition. Those at the lower end of the performance spectrum tend to be poorer at metacognition. And to determine that, you could simply ask a student who's done poorly on a test how they think they did on the test. And often those students who've done poorly will think that they've done quite well. Or if you ask them to identify the things that they missed, they are not able to do that kind of thinking about their thinking. So we want to talk about how to develop and what kinds of assessments we can give to develop these metacognitive skills in our students. And of course, we'll discuss the need to use assessment results to inform instructional decisions. And for most of us, we, as teachers, we are professors, we know a lot about assessment. We routinely give both formative and summative assessments throughout the semester. However, that word assessment always creeps in when it comes to our accrediting bodies or accreditation organizations. So in Atlanta, where Georgia Perimeter is located, and I see my colleague Alice Pierce is here on the webinar. Hey, Alice. We have the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, and they are constantly monitoring what the schools in the association do in terms of assessment. And not only are you assessing, but how you use those assessment results. So at some point, I'll briefly mention some of the new things that we're implementing at Georgia Perimeter, and then that'll be part of the sharing session. We'll ask you guys if you'd like to chat and share some of the things that you're doing. And of course, we'll share ideas with each other along the way. I really don't want to talk, for 30 minutes or more straight. I want you to be able to participate and ask your questions and also give your ideas about things, because we're really here to share ideas on how to better assess our students' learning. Because often it's not that our students haven't learned, it's that they don't show as much on assessment as they have learned. And so sometimes we beat ourselves up about bad assessments, but our students, sometimes when you talk with them about the concepts, they actually do better than the assessment scores reflect. So hopefully we can share some ideas along the way about how to assess students and how to improve their assessment performances. So of course, assessment is the measuring of student performance against a predefined set of learning outcomes. So we have these objectives that we cover in college algebra, or we cover in pre-calculus or calculus 1. And we know what those objectives are in advance, and we tell our students in advance what those objectives are. Sometimes they're very discrete, small objectives that are very easy to measure, and sometimes the objective is to solve a problem that might really involve a number of kinds of objectives put together in order to solve a bigger problem. So we're often operating at the upper end of the cognitive spectrum in terms of having our students to analyze and problem solve and synthesize. But we have to have our objectives predefined in advance, and I think math faculty are among the best at predefining performance measures that we want to measure. Our objectives are often very clear, both to our students and to ourselves. So the learning objective is a statement that specifically describes this measurable skill, knowledge, or attitude that a learner should be able to demonstrate after instruction. Now, we often have a lot of skills, as I just mentioned, knowledge, obviously, but sometimes we also can affect the attitude of our learners in our classrooms. And I always think, I've really done my job when I have a student who comes to me at the end of the semester and says, I really like this class. I think I want to be a math teacher. I think that's sort of the ultimate, or I want to be an engineer. I tend to teach a lot of the introductory freshman level courses, so I don't have a lot of prospective engineers or scientists in my classes. I have more liberal arts type majors. But when they say I would like to be a teacher, I know that I have really affected the attitude of the student. It always makes me feel like I've done my job. So defining the specific learning objective to be measured has to occur prior to both instruction and assessment. So obviously, and most of this all of you already know, but if you haven't defined in advance what it is you're measuring, it becomes impossible to measure. So I want to stop briefly and ask you just to write in the chat box. We'll just share a few things about whether or not you define and publish your learning objectives for your students, and if so, how do you present them? So I will tell you, for example, I'll just say mine and you guys can type. I see someone says syllabus. Absolutely, we put those on our syllabus. We define modules in our, we use D2L as our learning management system, and in the online department where I work, we define our objectives by module. So not just in the syllabus or in the course outline, but also in this module you will be able to, and then we list those objectives. Okay, so I see other people have chapter modules in the learning management system and the syllabus and part of each day's introduction. Great. So most of us, when we go in the classroom, because we're teaching in a quantitative subject, we often say, today we're going to, and so it becomes really second nature to us on how to describe to our students what it is that we're trying to present to them. So I don't think it's ever a surprise in math what it is that they're trying to learn. And I see someone puts it in on their test reviews. Absolutely. So we tell them very clearly what it is that we want them to learn, and then we go about giving the instruction, and then defining the questions that will assess it. And someone says at the beginning of every new topic, and that's also a great way to let students know what it is you expect them to learn. We also tend, as math teachers, to connect back to previously taught content. So we'll say things like, remember when we, and we'll name another objective, and we'll say, this topic is very similar to that, and the difference is. So we'll often connect our material to previously learned material, or project that material to what it will be connected to in the future. So these taxonomies of learning are used to describe the different levels of learning, and the most common one that was used for years and years and years was Bloom's. And I think any of you who've gone through a college of education may know the Bloom's taxonomy, and it was very useful for defining verbs that help us to describe what it is our students are going to do. And I've used this taxonomy to demonstrate over the years my students' different levels of learning, from knowledge to analysis to synthesis, all along the spectrum of learning. But the one that I've become interested in most interested in lately is the Marzano's taxonomy, a new taxonomy of educational objectives, and that's because this one addresses metacognition. And there's also the Creating Significant Learning Experiences by Fink, and that's another taxonomy that you may be familiar with, and if you're not familiar with, you might want to take a look at all of these, because all of these taxonomies help us to prepare the objectives in a way that they are presented in a measurable way for our assessments. And so we have the resources for the taxonomies listed here. Obviously, you would be able to go back and view the webinar and look at these resources, but all of these, of course, can be found online. The Bloom's taxonomy, the Marzano, and the Fink taxonomy are all available for you to take a look at online. And let me go out to this Marzano taxonomy, and I think you guys will be able to see that. Let's see. Let me make sure that if you can see my desktop, if you can see that, would you please give me a green check so I would know that you could see that? Hold on a minute. I've got to find my... Yes, and Bloom's has been updated. So I think, okay, so were you able to see, if someone could tell me, were you able to see? Okay, let me share my screen so that you can see in my desktop. All right, so you can see my desktop now. And I want you to see this taxonomy. One second, there we go. All right, so let's look at this Marzano's taxonomy. And I'll talk just briefly about what it is about the Marzano taxonomy that I think is very, very interesting. So you may remember from Bloom's taxonomy that it lays out the levels of learning, and it starts out with a basic level of knowledge, like description things, like students memorizing dates and names and that sort of thing, all the way up through analysis, which is a very complicated breaking down of complicated problems. But in that taxonomy, they were basically just describing, helping you to describe using active verbs that were measurable, the kinds of objectives that you could, how to define your objectives that would be measurable on a test or a quiz or that sort of thing. One of the things that it didn't really account for, although I know it's implied in the updated version, and also throughout educational psychology and the learning of how students learn, we talk about the basic needs. I mean, you could even go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and talk about what are the kinds of things that students need in order to be successful. And we, as classroom teachers, we know that. And for those of us who teach at commuter schools where students are generally not living on campus, working full-time, it's from car to class and then to job and then back home and car to class and not hanging out at school a lot, we know that our students struggle with their daily life demands. So we know these things maybe without even having seen these kinds of taxonomies. But the three systems and knowledge that Marzano talks about, the first system is the self system, where the student has to believe that the learning is important. And I know that sometimes in our subject, which is a required subject, students are taking because they have to take the course to graduate. It's not necessarily in their major. It's just required by the core curriculum. It's not something that they really wanted, quote unquote, to study, and it's not an elective that they've chosen to take. Sometimes that self-system of how important is this, how am I going to be efficient and effectively learn this material, and how do I feel about the learning of mathematics? Sometimes those self-systems are really low in the students who are taking our classes. Often you will hear students say, I only have, this is the last class I have to have for graduation. I don't know if any of you have ever heard that before, but sometimes you'll hear that kind of speak from students, and sometimes students will have a lot of emotions related to their learning. Hold one second, please. I apologize. Sorry about that. I'm working from home today, and my dogs decided to bark at the postman. And so, but the part that I like to talk about is that metacognitive part of the Bloom's taxonomy, which is so important, I think, for our students. So specifying learning goals. Now, we do that for the student, but also the student has to have a learning goal, and that is they really need to want to learn the material, not just make a score on the test. And unfortunately, again, because we're not an elective topic in most cases, the students have a harder time defining their own learning goals for the courses. They have to monitor their execution of knowledge. Now, we assist them in doing that with what is called a formative assessment, and we'll talk more about those. But often we do in mathematics probably more than in any other subject in collegiate material. We do have other kinds of assessments besides a paper or a midterm and a final exam. We'll have these formative assessments to let students know how they're doing along the way. Sometimes it's just in the form of self-assessment, like doing homework problems. But they've got to know how to monitor the execution of their knowledge and to know when they've studied enough or what they need to study in order to do well on the assessments. They have to monitor their own clarity. Students don't always know, as I mentioned before, about clarity and accuracy. When you give a student a test, the student who is at the higher end of performance, who does well on the test, you can ask that student, how do you think you did? And that student will say something like, oh, I think I did pretty good, but maybe I missed the one where we cut the corners out of the cardboard to make the box with the maximum volume. So that student at the upper end of the performance, or doing well, who is doing well on the objectives, can clearly monitor what they're doing and understand what knowledge they lack or where they may have made a mistake. Whereas a student who's at the lower end of the performance ladder, when you ask them, again, as I mentioned before, how do you think you did on the test, the student will often over-predict how well they did. And then they'll also not be able to identify at all which problems they missed. If you say, well, which ones do you think that you missed? Well, they think they did well, or they will say, well, I'm not sure what I missed. They just don't have the clarity or the ability to monitor their clarity or their accuracy. And then the cognitive system, knowledge, comprehension, analysis, and doing the problem solving that we require in our coursework, that is very similar to the Bloom's taxonomy in terms of a lower level kind of learning up to what we do every day in the mathematics classroom, which is decision making and problem solving. So we are often working at the upper end of that cognitive spectrum. And so I really have found this to be useful, and I will talk about another resource for helping students to become better at metacognition, because I think that that is the key to our having our students perform better on tests. And that is for them to actually identify that they don't know something and to go and actually study it before the test. I don't know about your students, but in my 29 years of teaching, my experience has been when students are doing mathematics, often they think all they have to do is do the homework, and if they've done the homework, then they've quote-unquote studied. And that, as we know, doesn't always work. So there's the Bloom's taxonomy, the Marsano's taxonomy, and the Fink taxonomy. And I would suggest that you take a look at all of these and compare them all, because I think that they're all very, very good in helping you to identify the kinds of things that you will see in terms of defining your learning objectives. All right, so now I want to go back to the slideshow and talk about the different types of assessments that I've actually talked about. There are very casual assessments. We casually assess our students when we say something like, does everyone understand how to complete the square? Or does everyone understand how I got this slope or this derivative or something like that? So we're monitoring casually all the time how our students are doing on these learning objectives. So you've got anecdotal observations, you look at their facial expressions, and then we also have the dreaded final exam, which is the one thing, or the assessment instrument, the one thing that tells us whether or not we've met our goals or the students have met their goals. And of course, these fall generally into two categories, formative and summative. And as I said, often math professors do a lot of formative assessments along the way before these summative assessments come along. Most of us will do quizzes, or if not quizzes, we'll do a couple of tests, or 4 tests maybe, before the final exam. So students have some kind of feedback before they get to that final, that final large assessment. Also, I think a lot of us are now using technology in the classroom, a variety of different kinds of technology, anything from graphing calculators to clickers to publisher software, where students are getting immediate feedback on their responses to questions. So if you're using a clicker in a classroom, obviously you're doing assessment. You're doing that formative assessment, so to inform you how you're doing and to inform the students how they're doing. So these formative assessments are ongoing, and their reviews and quizzes and the behavioral observations, such as everybody is, frowning, like maybe I've got the wrong sign, or they're not sure how I got what I wrote on the board, or maybe I've transposed something and I've confused them. So you're monitoring that behavioral observation. They're more frequent than the summative assessments. Typically, you may give a midterm, you may give a final exam, you may have an assessment instrument that your college asks you to employ in your classes, like we do at Georgia Perimeter. One of the things that we do for our classes is we give an assessment, and our dean really likes us to give them every semester, at least once a year, if not every semester. And we use the results of those assessments to adjust the teaching guide, create supplements for the courses, look at questions on the assessments to see if it was just a bad question, and see what it is that we need to do to adjust our teaching or to adjust the question to make sure students are learning. One of the things that we have just added coming this fall are things that we're calling core concepts. So every instructor in every course across the college will be assessing on 3 core concepts, or 3 to 4 core concepts before the final exam. So we have these benchmark dates by which every instructor will give the same kind of assessment, so that we can look across the board how students are doing on the objectives of the course before we get to that big assessment instrument that's at the end. These formative assessments allow students to improve their metacognitive skills. So when they take a quiz, or they are asked a question in class on a clicker and they don't get that question right, and they get the feedback that they've made a mistake, then they're given information about what it is that they don't know, so they can start to think about their learning and why they haven't learned that, and what kind of adjustments they have to make in order to improve on that particular objective. So having these formative assessments spread throughout the semester are very, very useful, and having technology that does it, which again, most of us are using some kind of technology now for students to do homework. If not, the old-fashioned kind of formative assessment was do the odd problems, check your answer in the back of the book. That is, a type of formative assessment that will tell the student whether or not they're progressing on the learning objective. And again, you do something with those formative assessment results, and you say, okay, I gave this quiz, and it looks like this particular section didn't do well. I'm going to go over that topic again, or I'm going to ask these students to stay after class, and we'll do a short makeup session, or I'll be sure to put this on my test review. All those kinds of instructional adjustments you make that your accrediting bodies are going to look for. Of course, all accredited institutions are required to do some kind of formative assessment to see how well students are meeting the learning objectives of the class. But not only that, not only are we reporting the results, we're also adjusting our instructional practices to make sure that if students aren't performing up to the level that is acceptable, that we do something to change that to make sure that they're able to reach our level of objective. So let's talk about some practices that you have in your classes. Maybe you grade homework for a certain percentage, or you give quizzes. What do you do for formative types assessments in your classroom? And do you use those to modify your instruction? So if you give quizzes, you give homework, what do you do to let your students know how they're doing before they take the actual more formative assessment, say the first test? So quizzes every day. Great way to take roll, and also a great way to see how your students are doing. So quizzes every day, doing homework, and practice tests in groups. That's a great way for students to give feedback to each other, and that is to talk with each other about the mathematics. The research says that students who talk about the mathematics absolutely do better than students who don't. If you can get them to form study groups outside of class to do practice tests, or if you have time for them to do practice tests inside of class, obviously that's something that's very, very helpful to them in preparing. I wrote that we give 6 quizzes in our online Math 1001, which is our freshman liberal arts, basically non-math science major math. And so we have in our online department, we have 6 units or 6 modules. So we give 6 quizzes, and then they have a midterm and a final. So those quizzes help them prepare for that midterm and final. Joe says he uses clickers. I think that more and more people are using clickers to sort of gauge the level of understanding in the classroom, so you can adjust immediately instead of having to wait until the end of the assessment until the assessment results are in. So it looks like a lot of folks do formative assessments such as quizzes and homework. And also in most of the software that we use, regardless of the publisher, you are able to see the results of quizzes that students have taken online or homework that they've taken online. Do some sort of item analysis, so you can take those formative assessments and come back to class and adjust your teaching. So these are all different ways that you can do these formative assessments to make sure that your students know what's going on before, quote unquote, the big test. So talk a little bit more about metacognition, and I've alluded to this so many times throughout this presentation because this is the area of cognitive psychology I've really become interested in lately, and that is basically thinking about learning, or students thinking about the learning process. And a student who is good at metacognition has the ability to assess his or her understanding of that objective. The lower performing students tend to have weaker metacognitive skills, as I mentioned, and when you have more frequent assessments and feedback, it helps the student to improve these metacognitive skills. So once a student's done a homework or has been presented a question with a clicker, they may get positive feedback results, yes, you know that topic, or they may not get positive feedback. They may get feedback that they don't know that topic, so they need to adjust. And every time we give them that little piece of information that says, this is a place where you're weak, you need to study more, we're helping them to develop better metacognition skills. And these kinds of assessments, the research has shown they work best when they're low risk. So you want students to not be afraid to do these sort of formative assessments. In other words, you may use the clicker grade as attendance, but you don't count it against them so that they're reluctant to, they're afraid to show up and answer the question. Or you may allow them perhaps to take the quiz more than once if it's online and it's done outside of class. Or you may allow them to, some people do makeup exams. I mean, the philosophies differ all across the board on different ways that you can make assessments low risk. These online homework systems where students can get an algorithmically generated problem, and if they miss it, try it again. Those certainly are low risk, or they're lower risk than just having one chance to answer a question. So students, especially the students who are at the lower end, or the lower performing students, they need these assessments to be somewhat low risk so they're not afraid to continue to try them. So do you do any kind of low risk metacognitive activities? So for example, I'm going to type mine in as, I let my students take their quizzes 3 times. Because all of my classes are online, and I can allow my students to take the quizzes more than once. So it's not as high stakes, and I kind of have the feeling that students don't cheat as often online when they have the ability to take the quiz more than once. I know that having someone else do your work is sort of a value system. It's very hard to regulate, but in the I guess about 12 years since I've been using technology, I have found that when I allow my students to do the quizzes more than once, they do better on the final exam. And on the final exam, of course, our exams are proctored, students are ID'd, they're logged in with a password into the test and monitored very closely. So when they do well on that proctored assessment, I know that these low-risk formative assessments have been good. Someone says test corrections. Let the students do their test corrections. Absolutely. That's a very low-stakes way to go back and correct your mistakes. And having part of the exam take home. Absolutely. Let them work together and talk about things. So having any kind of low-stakes assessment, formative assessment, where you can get students together talking about the mathematics, doing the problems over and over, like homework or quizzes, all of those are going to help students do better on the next, which, the next quote unquote big assessment, the big test, the one that really is high stakes, that not the formative assessment, but the summative assessment, where we're dependent on our students to show, yes, I'm doing my job, and the students are learning these objectives. And practice exams are great ways for students to learn in a low-risk environment. And it just seems that students who work on these low-risk assessments will do better on the higher-risk assessments when they get to those. Now, there's also the summative assessment, and summative assessments are used to evaluate the effectiveness of a course or program. So when you have a summative assessment, you really are summing up what the students have learned over the course of time, the semester. You could call, oops, what happened? You could call sorry about that. Let me go back. You could call a major test a summative assessment. If you've had 2 or 3 quizzes, those would be informing you, and then your summative assessment, how did the student do on the module test? This could also be a midterm exam. It could also be a final exam. Standardized tests such as the SAT or the college placement test or the Compass or the PERT test in Florida, these are all kinds of summative assessments that sum up how students have done or how they're doing on this big set of objectives, broader set of objectives than the more discrete, individualized module type of objectives that you might see on just a quiz or a homework or test. usually 1 or 2 times per course or program, although if you could think of your tests as both formative and summative kinds of assessments, and so you might have more than a couple of major tests. They allow you to modify future instructional practices. So for example, at GPC, we do these course assessments, minimum of every year. Like I said, our dean likes us to do them every semester, and I think for our certification, you have to do them every 3 years or so, but we know that if you wait 3 years, it's too late to implement changes, so we try to do them more frequently so that we can modify our future instructional practices. And again, the kind looking at the assessment items to see if it was a bad item. Sometimes you will find that it really, the item may have just been poorly written, and really the students probably knew that concept better than was reflected on that assessment. And again, as I've alluded to, it's part of the accreditation process: delivery, analysis, and instructional modification. So what new kinds of teaching processes will you deliver? How will you analyze how those changes affected? And what kinds of instructional modifications you will do to make sure that the students are going to learn that topic the next time the assessment comes up. So if you look at this teaching and learning and assessing process, it sort of goes like this. And this is you'll recognize this as something you do in the classroom daily. You have to define your desired learning outcome and provide for instruction. Now, it is possible that you do a diagnostic test and design an assessment and go right from the learning outcome to the assessment. And often this happens if you're teaching, for example, in some kind of a redesigned developmental math program where students are pre-tested to see if they're bringing certain knowledge with them. You know what you are going to test them over in a particular module. You design that assessment, and then you implement and score it, and then you may go back and provide instruction for the desired outcome. So this assessment, while generally takes place right after you've decided what you're going to teach or define your learning outcomes, sometimes the assessment comes in before the actual teaching if you're trying to test on prerequisite knowledge. And of course, these appropriate kinds of assessment activities could be formative or summative, and this dotted line takes you back to providing instruction for desired outcome, because if there's poor performance on the assessment, you've got to change something about the instruction. Now, in some programs, the student doesn't do well on the assessment, they're required to go back and do additional work and prove mastery of a concept before they can move on. So you've provided additional activities beyond just this one test, and so of course that wouldn't be a final exam. That would be some other kind of formative assessment that they've done, and they found that they haven't done well, and then they go back, get additional instruction, and then retake the assessment until they've achieved mastery. Now, many of us who teach in collegiate programs, although there are redesigned collegiate programs around the country where students are allowed to learn to a mastery status on objectives, a lot of us don't have the luxury of that. We give our tests, we have to move on to the next content, and then at the end of the semester we have this big summative assessment, and then we can hopefully make it better for the next group of students. But I noticed many of you said something about having students work together to correct mistakes or work on practice tests and those sort of things. So you can provide this additional instruction even in a typical classroom if it's provided that you have time. If you don't have time, obviously, you can encourage your students to work together in groups outside of the classroom on those kinds of assessments or the redoing of the instructional part. I know that many of us would like to be able to redo, our teaching before we go on, before we move on to this next module or topic or unit. We'd like to go back and help them with everything they missed the first time, but we simply can't because of the nature of the content. And I see in-class activities has been brought up where students are working together. and Gail says they're very popular in her classroom. I think you will find that students do like to work together, and by having them work together in the classroom, you also encourage their interaction outside of the classroom. I can remember very clearly when I was in college as a math student having study groups and working with my peers who were in the class. Unfortunately, our students don't tend to do those kinds of things without some sort of guidance these days, because I don't want to say that they are distracted by more things, but let's admit it, they're distracted by more things than we were. And so it's very difficult for them sometimes to get together outside of class, especially those of us teaching at these colleges where our students are part-time and working full-time and not living on campus. So how do you at your school use results of summative assessments to modify instruction? So I've said some of the ways that we do it. We adjust our teaching guides. We create supplemental materials such as worksheets or handouts that we give to students. Sometimes we actually modify the assessment instrument because we find out that, we really included a poorly written question. So what are some of the things that you do to use the results of the summative assessments to modify instruction? And we'll be using our formative assessments. These core concepts we'll be assessing on this semester for the first time to sort of inform our instruction along the way. But here we're talking about the summative assessment. So this would be at the end of the material. Okay, so Mickey says emphasizing the material that was poorly assimilated. So for the next semester, you've identified, okay, guys, this is what our classes didn't do as well on last semester as we had hoped. Let's really emphasize these topics in the coming semester. And I think, for many of us, and probably every one of you out there, we often know in advance of the test what it is they're going to have trouble with. We can predict which problems, but sometimes you'll see a test and you go, wow, I can't believe that they missed this concept. Where did I as a teacher fall short? Or where did I as a committee fall short? Or where do we as a committee? Joe says informal committee meetings, meeting periodically to discuss course and student results and adjust the content as appropriate. Absolutely. And as high schools make adjustments in their curriculum, such as the Common Core, which will be implemented, it's started to be implemented already. Maybe we'll have to make some adjustments in the way that in the objectives that we present. Maybe this time the students will come to us with a basic amount of prerequisite knowledge that we really need them to know to move on in our collegiate material. Maybe they won't. Maybe it won't do as much as we hoped it had. But I think that I know our accrediting bodies are looking at this, and like I shared, at our school, we have our committees that look at these, and we do different supplements. We look at the test items themselves. We also have the committee discuss, was it an appropriate topic for this course? Alice Pierce from GPC mentions instructors are given the information on the teaching guide and on the website and by email. That's correct. So Alice supervises adjunct faculty as the associate department chair. So she has to let all of those faculty members teaching those classes know that these are the things where we fell short if you were teaching college algebra. And so this is what the committee now has recommended that we do next semester. So she makes sure that they know that new teaching guide, that they know where the supplements are on the website, and she informs them that by email as well. All right. All right, so this is basically the end of, I see that Ralph is still typing. Let's see, department-wide assessments of learning outcomes are discussed at each department meeting. We get an idea of what topics are and aren't going well. Absolutely, and we do this in the hallway a lot as well on campus. I know that, after the first test, we'll often, when I taught on campus, we would be, grading our tests, and somebody would come by and say, oh, you look a little stressed in there. I'm like, yeah, I'm grading this first test, and they just did not get this topic. So you do it informally, but you also do it formally with your colleagues as well. So are there any other practices that you would like to share or any questions that you would like to ask about doing assessments at your institutions? I mean, there's so much research out there. I do want to type in the box some information that's not in the presentation, but if you are interested in the field of metacognition and how students learn, Stephen Chu out of Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, has won awards for his videos on YouTube on how to study. And these are videos that are aimed at students. So if you go to YouTube and put in Stephen Chu, How to Study, or Samford University, you will find his series of 5 videos that are very well done, very down to earth. He's actually a cognitive psychologist, and he talks the students through how do you study effectively. It's very generic. It's not for math. But I found it to be very helpful with my freshmen who sometimes don't think that you have to study math. They think that you just have to do the homework exercises. And they don't think that you have to do anything else like you would do in history, where you would go and actually study the concepts. So his last name is C-H-E-W, and it's typed there in the chat box. If you can see the chat box, it's S-T-E-P-H-E-N-C-H-E-W, Stephen Chu from Samford, that's with an M, S-A-M-F-O-R-D. And if you go to YouTube and put in How to Study Stephen Chu, there's a series of 5 videos that we have linked inside of our course template in our Math 1001 Online, and it's something that I think, they're very short. They're usually 5 to 8 minutes, and it's something that I think students can get a lot out of. And you know, we know our content, we teach our content, but often students are doing poorly on assessments because they simply haven't learned how to study. They don't understand about their own level of learning, so their metacognitive skills are very weak, especially those we're trying to pull up and pass the course, who are maybe struggling with the course. These kinds of videos and things can make a huge difference. So Nancy has posted a link there. I'm assuming, Nancy, that that's one of Stephen's videos that you've posted there. But it's one of the things that, thank you, Nancy, so much for that. It's one of the things that I think has informed my teaching the most in the last 3 years, is this series of videos, and trying to help my students understand how to know which concepts they understand in advance of the test and which concepts they don't, so they know what to practice on before they take the test. And in addition to knowing what to practice, also a test-taking strategy has always been to skip over the items you're not sure about. And for students who don't have a good grasp of what they know and don't know, they may spend way too much time on a particular item that they should have skipped. So understanding their own level of understanding or of learning of the content is, really critical in their doing better on these kinds of assessments. So, John, I can turn it back over to you for questions. Anyone wants to type a question in the box, you can do that. I'm going to type my email in the box if you have any follow-up questions about the Marzano's taxonomy or the Stephen Chu videos. It will be a very valuable thing that you will have learned today, because I really do believe that those videos are very helpful and very well made for students.
Okay, well, if you want to thank Sandee again in the chat room, that would be great. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask for the next few minutes. But thank you again for participating in today's AMATIC webinar. And if you'd like to support future AMATIC webinars, please consider becoming a member of AMATIC at bit.ly/join-AMATIC. And please remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/AMATIC. And recording of past AMATIC webinars can be found at bit.ly/amatic-webinars, and it typically takes us a few weeks to produce and upload webinars to this archive. And if you could please take 2 minutes to evaluate the webinar content and the presenter at bit.ly/amatic23, that would be great. And if you need an email confirmation of your participation in this webinar, please fill in the optional section at the end of the evaluation. I'll leave that link on the screen for a few minutes. And again, let's thank Sandee in the chat room, and I really appreciated your presentation, and I hope that you will all fill out the survey as well. So with that, I'm going to end the recording. And the recording is going to end now.